Hello, Desert, in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. This is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. And joining me from the not so sunny, dry heat of Arizona is Tom Hodkinson, who's joining me from South Wales. Tom, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, so I'm Tom and I'm currently an undergraduate at Durham University studying history. I've been a lifelong conservative, well, as long as I can really remember in my political age. Having first joined the party at the age of 12 and campaigned when I was 14. Um, and growing up in a very heavily Labour dominated area in South Wales. Um, but today, remarkably, it is quite sunny and quite warm in South Wales.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, looking through the drapes there, I was going to ask, it looked like beautiful sunshine. I mean, it looks warm. It might not be warm, but it kind of looks warm.
No, it is very warm. It's 31 degrees centigrade here.
Oh my goodness. That's that's a bit of a bit of a novelty this time of year, isn't it? I mean, it's almost June, I guess.
Yeah, but very much an anomaly here.
All right. Well, so Tom, I brought you on because I'm really interested to hear your take on the recent UK elections, the recent drama at Downing Street, and also what the meanings for the local elections are across the UK, and not just necessarily for the court politics at Westminster. But what was it like? You grew up in a Labour area, and I understand that you grew up in a Labour family.
Yes.
How did you end up a Tory?
Um, I suppose I suppose everyone would want me to say, well, I just read politics, so therefore you come to the natural conclusion that being a conservative is the right decision. Um, I think it was in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. I grew up in a Remain household, not a Leave household. Um, but just seeing how Labour was so disorganised and so focused on trying to reverse the referendum and not leave the EU despite the people's wishes, no matter the qualms, with the referendum and, maybe my own sentimental views of the EU that were quite positive. I still believed we had a referendum, so therefore we should respect the wishes of the people. And also, if you just have another referendum, the levers will be like, well, we need a third one to decide it, and it's just going to breed complete chaos. So I was completely disillusioned with Labour by 2016. I then looked for a new political sort of home. And so then at that time, you only really had the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives. And back then, the Liberal Democrats were pretty much a joke as much as they are now. And so I sort of landed in the Conservative Party. They were very welcoming. They seemed the most sensible. They seemed to have sort of an idea of what they wanted to do with the country. And I suppose what really attracted me to them was that they're a broad church party like Labour, but the pragmatism that is core to their belief means that despite their disagreements, they can operate as one party. The Labour Party, as we will discuss throughout the elections point and with Starmer, because it's so factionalised, but they're so ideological, it can never really function as a single party because each
Mhm.
faction is vying for power over the other.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really an interesting take. I've always believed that, and again, I'm not in the UK. I haven't spent much time in the UK. And I mean, your conception of the broad church of each party is well taken. And but the Labour broad church can only ever seem to agree on we should be in power,
Yes. Yes.
whereas the conservative broad church generally thinks we should be in power and we should govern well,
Yeah.
competently,
Yeah.
right? Now, after that, then of course is, well, what does it mean to govern well, and what does it mean to govern competently, and all those other questions enter into it. But at least there's this notion that at least if the government is competent, the party factions will be most of the party factions in the Conservative Party will be relatively silent.
Yes, I mean Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is an MP and leader of the House of Commons, he said that, despite many of the people within his own party he disagreed with, he always felt they could come together and form an agreement at some point. They may have deep differences, but that's part of the legislative process, is that you do have disagreements, but you can form legislation from that. Labour's so
Right.
ideologically driven, they refuse to compromise. And you saw that with the welfare spending bill that collapsed earlier this year. Starmer just had to cede it as an issue because he couldn't get round to his backbenchers on the hard left or even on the soft left to reduce welfare spending.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is not it's not just in the UK. It's in Britain, and maybe in some levels the United States too. Sorry, in Europe, but also in the United States too. That there are really difficult fiscal questions that are being asked of every major government in the West right now.
Yep.
And it is really difficult. You know, it is very easy to attack any solution for on ideological grounds.
Yes.
But at some point gonna have somebody's gonna have to agree to something. And I mean, this is why we're seeing governments collapse in Germany all the time. Governments collapse in France. I mean, the Italy somehow is not collapsing. It does not have frequent government collapses, which is kind of a shock. But like across the Western Hemisphere, especially in Europe, there's governments just can't maintain the support of the House for very long.
Yeah. Um, and as you said, there's some very difficult fiscal questions that need to be answered, and a lot of the times the answers are very unpopular. Um,
Yeah.
and I think, this is a broader issue of governments are less pragmatic and more moved by the wind of the media, and so they try and follow, they try and look for clicks and for instant support rather than laying firm foundations. And I suppose that's also what drew me to the Conservative Party, is that this sense of we will plant the tree that we'll never sit in the shade of, but my grandson or my great grandson will sit in the shade of. This sense of building something to last and making sure that the state will be there in 200 years' time.
Right. I love that. I love that. That speaks to me. Maybe that's speaking to my conservatism, but it speaks to me. Uh, so the local Tom, can you maybe talk a little bit about like what are the local elections
Okay.
for an American audience? Like what are they? They're clearly not a general election. So what are they?
Yeah, so there was a lot of talk, which I was sort of rather confused by, because I suppose American politics has become so deeply embedded within our culture over here in terms of what that's the thing that people watches through sort of popular culture and shows. So everyone was saying over here, these are not like a midterm in the US, and that's exactly right. These are local elections are for local councillors. So within a constituency where an MP represents a constituency of about 70,000 people in Parliament, within that constituency you've got councils and then wards. Wards are sort of areas of about a couple of hundred people to a couple of thousand, and that's represented by a local councillor who then they make decisions basically on council tax, bin collection, potholes. So general sort of really local maintenance sort of administration tasks. And so people don't really view them with a lot of importance because typically, whether it's a Conservative councillor, a Labour councillor, Reform councillor, or a Liberal Democrat councillor, the bins are always going to be taken out because they sort of have to be. The potholes will be filled, although largely at a very slow rate. And things will get done because they just have to be done. and so a lot of people don't really pay much attention, don't really like to vote in them because it's not like this sense of massive change at the central level. They don't have a lot of power, they can't control your broader taxes, they can't inform broader parliamentary change. And so that creates two things when looking at these results is a lot of people use these opportunities to protest vote. So they will vote for a party to say, I'm displeased with the direction that Westminster's going in. Not necessarily I support Reform UK or Labour, but to say I'm not happy with whoever's in government. In a way, much like a midterm, where people use it as a chance to say I'm not happy with what's happening in Washington. But the other side to that is because they can't actually inform any real change within Westminster. They can only sort of tell Westminster we're not happy with what you're doing, so change tact. It's it means that then less people sometimes do vote. So I think when I'm looking at these results for the local councils, I'm thinking how many Labour voters were actually voting? How many Labour voters thought, I'm not happy with Labour, but I can't bring myself to vote for anyone else, so I just won't go and vote? Because it doesn't really matter. The bins will still be taken out. This isn't me fighting for my political life within the country. Unlike, and there's the difference with the midterms is there's a lot of mobilization for voters in midterms, I believe, in the states, because either the incumbents are saying, look, you need to do this so that we can continue with our legislative agenda, or the opposition is saying, you need to get out and vote to stop this legislative agenda. That's not really the same. There's not the same amount of mobilization and, in a way, motivation to vote because it won't have the same impact. So I think
Right. I mean, yeah. Sorry. I mean, I'm just gonna just jump in here for a second. I can imagine whether, like, if I live in, let's say, Wales, you know, I don't really care who my local counselor is that much, right? I might be a very staunch, ardent Green Party supporter, but like, if I have a Reform UK counselor, it doesn't, I know that my life isn't going to be radically changed very much one way or the other.
exactly.
I can stomach it.
Yeah. So I think that's very important when looking at these results is both people will use these as opportunities to protest, and so therefore will vote in a way more with their heart than with their head. But some people also just will not vote because they're like, at the end of the day, the wind is blowing in favour of reform. My vote for Labour won't really count. I'd much rather do something else today. So let it be a Reform UK councillor. It won't affect me.
Okay, but that being said, um, you know, people are treating these results, or at least the media is treating these results, and labor, and there will always be those with something to gain politically by treating these results as if they are uh, a major indictment or celebration of the government empowered Westminster.
So I think there's an element why it should be because it sort of act as sort of a really accurate poll effectively. You can
Mhm.
see, where people are actually standing because polls have their faults, who's actually participating in the poll. But in an election like this, you can see, okay, people really are fed up with Labour. And so even if it is a protest vote that's largely going to reform, it still shows that Labour does need to change tact in Westminster. Um, and I think so it has really broad impacts. There's a massive ripple that goes throughout British politics from these elections. But I think it's always just important to take it with a pinch of salt of this does
Right.
not mean Labour's vote has collapsed. Labour will not win the next general election just because Reform UK have done really, really well. And I think
I mean, I think we've seen Reform UK do well in local elections of the past, right? That have not, or UKIP, or whichever version of Nigel Farage's movement. They've done very well in local elections in the past. Maybe not this well, but they've done very well in local elections in the past. But that has not translated into success in Parliament.
Yeah, so I mean, every single year there is an election going on in England. Um, so it's not all of the local councils go up for election every single year. They do it in sort of phases. So sort of like senators, it's not every senator is re-elected at every 6 years. They go off every so often. Um, and so there were local elections last year, which Reform did very well in. They won a couple of mayoralties, and so that again, the same thing has happened. And so there are, I suppose, three ripple effects. I'm just trying to think three ripple effects, sort of that that do show this. So one is the protest aspect. It does show Labour needs to change tact, and that's what we've seen in terms of Labour MPs becoming increasingly upset very quickly with Keir Starmer and the direction of his government, and so the desire to unseat him and change leader. So because of that protest and opinion poll esque nature of these election results. Two, for Reform, it makes them sort of really, it allows them to actually nail down some experience and say this is what we've done, and say we've lowered your council tax in this council, we've we've removed the pride flags from that council building, we've done this, we've done that, and they can actually, Reform UK, what, founded in just before the 2024 general election. They had no experience, they had no um, results to point to. People were voting with them just on a hope. But now that they control councils, they actually are in positions of power. Even though limited, they can prove themselves as effective compared to the status quo. And the third thing, which I think is this is a more structural point, is when you lose councillors, you lose your activists, you lose your campaigners, those people who will go out for you during your local elections, during your general elections, and they will campaign for you for free because it's their job as well. And I think what will be more common within the Conservative Party is that these councillors are going to be disheartened. They're going to look at their party and think, well, you haven't supported me, so I shouldn't support you anymore. And in some cases, a lot of these councillors are very dedicated to just local service, and that's what they want to do. And it's their job. A lot of these councillors will now, who have lost their seats, have lost their jobs. And, some of them have been in power for, they've had that job for 8, 10 years. That's not easy just to walk away from. And so I think with a lot of Conservative councillors specifically, you'll see that a lot of them go to Reform because they'll be like, well, all I care about really is serving my community the best way possible. And the Conservative Party or the Labour Party is not enabling that anymore. They're inhibiting it. The party that is enabling it is Reform UK. And I think Reform UK would welcome a lot of small c Conservative or even big C Conservative candidates to come and work for them because they're experienced and they're not quite as dodgy in the sense of some of the other Reform UK councillors that sometimes get through their vetting systems. So
Yeah, they come with they come with a degree of professionalism that
yeah,
they're pre-vetted.
yeah. So I think that's probably the bigger issue
Yeah.
is that
Mhm.
what we're seeing, especially within the Conservative Party, is the grassroots are disappearing, and that's
Yeah.
so important for when mounting campaigns on a national level and also retaining support. Is when your
Mhm.
grassroots disappear, they stop voting for you, they stop campaigning for you. If you can't campaign, you can't rely on core voters to vote for you, then the party is on its way to extinction, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, in British UK politics, has been a major party that was essentially went extinct
Yeah.
in the Liberal Party after the First World War. So it's not like this has never happened before. It's been 100 years since one of the major parties has disappeared, but
Yeah.
that 100 years isn't all that long of a time in politics
No.
in some ways. In some ways, a week is a very long time in politics, and in another sense, a century isn't very long. Um, Okay, so you're in Wales, and Wales saw a pretty interesting result. Can you walk us through what happened there?
Yes. Okay. So in the UK, much like the States again, there are sort of tributary powers other than the central government. So we have smaller assemblies and parliaments for different parts of the United Kingdom. So in Wales, we have the Senedd or the Welsh Parliament. Um, and so, again, every 5 years, it goes up for election. Um, and so typically Wales has been very Labour dominated, with a lot of working class communities, especially with the coal mining industry being very heavily dominated within Wales, especially within the South Wales Valley's coalface, um, with then minor support for sort of Plaid Cymru and Liberal Democrats and Greens, and then Conservative Party or the Welsh Conservatives within the last Welsh Parliament were the opposition. Um, Labour was in a minority government relying upon Plaid Cymru every so often to win votes in the Senedd. Um, but as I was explaining to you before, being a Conservative in Wales is really quite taboo, um, especially since Margaret Thatcher and the closure of the mines. A lot of the communities, especially sort of not too far from where I live, they were built around the mines. Um, and so their livelihood was the mine, their life, their culture, everything was to do with the mine. And so when those closed and disappeared, people ended up without jobs. Everything that they had known just went. And these communities are sort of quite insular in a way. Grandparents live next to to their children live next to them, and so you just have this really conglomeration of culture and memory all mixed into one, of this sense of do not vote Conservative because they closed our mine, which was our lifeline and our lifeblood of this community. And so what we saw in the elections was a rejection of Labour, a rejection of the Conservatives, and sort of a move towards Plaid Cymru. Um, Not necessarily because of independence, though. I mean, uh, Plaid Cymru were very eager to make sure to emphasise that independence wasn't on the ballot this time. That
Yeah.
that is their eventual goal, but this time that's not going to be happening within this Senedd session.
Right.
Um,
So let's talk a little bit about Plaid Cymru and like what do they believe? You mentioned independence, they're the Welsh Nationalist Party. What does that actually mean? What are like are how long have they existed? Like are they do they have the same kind of like legacy of like Sinn Féin? Or are they kind of newer like the SNP? Like what's the
yeah,
history here?
I'd say they're much more um, like the SNP. Um, I mean, they did they were established in 1925, so basically 100 years ago, but only have become sort of a real political force within the last sort of 5-10 years. Much like the SNP, it sort of really came about. I mean, firstly, with the establishment of the Welsh Parliament under Tony Blair and his constitutional reforms 27 years ago. Um, and this sort of casual assuasion of feelings of Welsh independence and Welsh nationalism through the Welsh Parliament fed more deeply into a desire for it. So typically, so Plaid Cymru are quite left wing, so they're very much similar to Labour and the Greens. They believe in expanding welfare. They believe in Wales being sort of a sanctuary country for migration. They believe in, you know, they're just very much of the ilk of Labour and the Green Party. Um, but the one distinguishing point is they want to eventually see Wales to be independent. So they want that to go through a process of the Welsh Parliament gaining greater autonomy from Westminster, having more responsibility. They want Wales to see fairer funding. They often say fairer funding, as if per capita Wales doesn't get more money than England anyway. But they basically want to see Westminster give more money to Wales so they can spend more on doing things for Wales. And eventually, I suppose what they want to do is prove that Wales can be independent and prove that a Welsh government works better for Welsh people than a government based in Westminster. Um, and that would then eventually give the impetus for independence.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I'm just the one thing that is sort of interesting to me is I on the one hand, being Canadian, I kind of look at nationalist parties through the lens of like the Parti Québécois in Quebec, where they want independence. Every election or whether they actually want a referendum and want to separate kind of depends on election cycle versus election cycle. But they, in Quebec, but they, but it's certainly part of their, it doesn't sound like that's quite the same case with Plaid Cymru. But what's interesting about the Parti Québécois is, although very left wing economically, culturally they tend to be pretty right wing, and which is sort of part of their nationalist ethos,
Yeah.
and they do not like much immigration. They want total control of immigration. And it's interesting that you mentioned immigration. They're far more okay with being a sanctuary and with migration. Now, I mean, I can kind of understand that at an economic level, but it's interesting that you've got this nationalist party in Plaid Cymru with that's probably trying to foster, I imagine, a pretty difficult language, the spread of a pretty difficult language, and distinct language. How do they manage to square that circle? Or do they in your mind?
I mean, I've never really thought about that point really. I suppose those two issues have sort of been very distinct, um, in the sense of yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think they do square that circle.
Hmm.
Because I think they do a very good job at keeping those two issues very, very separate, of being both
Mhm.
nationalist and very proud of their cultural identity as Welsh people, um, but then also being, yes, pro migration, migrants completely welcome in Wales. Um, yeah, I just don't think they do square that circle. I think, and I think this speaks to the broader thing of they really do emphasize different things at certain times.
Mhm.
And I think they really did try this moment to sort of de-emphasize the sort of independence point within this election cycle, to not try and dissuade left-wing voters who were considering Labour or the Greens. So I think suppose this again, migration, pretty big issue at the moment in UK politics. They're more emphasising the positives, of migration within Wales, um, but not emphasising so much the nationalist aspects.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, again, I don't necessarily know that they're mutually exclusive. That you have to necessarily be anti-immigration if you're going to be pro-nationalist. I don't necessarily think they are. They just typically are if we're going across broad global trends. I mean, and if they weren't, I again, that's really interesting, right? That they think that there might be another way to do that. But all right, but Plague Cymru did unexpectedly well, right?
Somewhat expectedly.
Okay.
Um, I, Plaid, it was. I think it was less close than people thought, but everyone thought, Reform and Plaid would do particularly well in this election. Wales had been run by Labour for 27 years. Wales had never lost an election effectively in Wales for over 100 years. Um, and so everyone thought, well, Labour's going to be pummeled in this election because Wales is the worst out of all the three areas within the United Kingdom, excluding Northern Ireland. We have the longest NHS waiting lists. Our public transport is awful. the results of our education system are the worst within the United Kingdom. So everyone expected Labour would do really badly. But where those votes would go was sort of a toss up between Reform and Plaid. The fact it was not as close as people had expected, well, that's unexpected. But the fact that Plaid came first and did so well isn't so unexpected.
Okay. So what was the final result? Does Plaid have a majority in the Senate?
No, so Plaid is minority. 40. So it's 49 seats needed for a majority, and Plaid Cymru got 43. Uh, so they don't need to form a coalition. They can remain a minority government and then rely
Right.
upon certain parties as and when they need them
Case
to
by
pass
case.
legislation. Yeah, which would presumably be Labour, because Labour are the next largest left wing party within the Senedd with 9 seats, which would get them over the threshold. The Liberal Democrats and the Greens got 3 seats between them, so that wouldn't be enough for Plaid Cymru to get the threshold, and they probably wouldn't be able to work out a deal with Reform or the Conservatives.
Right. And so what was the how many seats did Reform end up with?
34, so they didn't do quite as well as expected. But again, they wouldn't be able to form a coalition with anyone
Sure.
because Plaid Cymru, Labour, Green, and the Liberal Democrats said they wouldn't. The
Well,
Conservatives left it open. They didn't expressly say no. They kept sort of deflecting and say we want to be the party in power. But even if they were to make form a coalition, that still wouldn't reach enough seats with the Conservatives 7 seats and Reform UK. That still only takes them to 41, which is 8 seats short of a majority.
you know what? This is just good political advice for any political party out there. Never be the junior party in a coalition,
Yeah,
especially if you consider yourself a big dog. It's one thing if you don't consider yourself a big dog, and this is like your one way to wield influence in a century, then maybe do it. But if you're a big dog party, never sit in a passenger seat in a coalition. In a situation like the Tories are in, like, listen, we'll be the third largest party or the fourth largest party. That's okay.
yeah. I think in a way it gives the Conservatives just time to regroup, recalculate what they need to do in Wales, criticise where necessary, but without being, because they're no longer the opposition party, they can really choose. They can really pick their battles wisely. They can choose what they want to fight the Welsh government on, and therefore
Well,
leave Reform to sort of tackle the broad brush attacks, and then just go after specific things and really, try and win the battles that they choose.
yeah. I mean, you'd rather be the leader, the chief opposition party, but I mean, at the same time, it I'd rather be the fourth largest party, independent, in a legislature in a parliament, than be
Yeah.
the junior partner of anybody, let alone the junior partner of an opposition party.
Yes.
So, and yeah, and you never know. There might be a time when it makes sense for because Plaid Cymru plus the Tories does equal a majority, and there might be a vote where that's useful,
Yes.
where that actually is what you're looking for. So you just never know what 5 years. You never know what comes out in 5 years. Don't tie yourself to anything.
Exactly.
No. All right. Well, that's really interesting. And I mean, and so what you mentioned sort of the economic, the educational, the logistical and transportation challenges that Wales is facing. Um, what is it that they're so disappointed by in the Labour government? I mean, there hadn't been a Labour government since 2010. So why are they so disappointed?
So I suppose it's because it's maintained the status quo. Um, Keir Starmer in the 2024 general election campaign broadly spoke of change, but nothing has changed. And I think specifically within Wales, there was a lot of promises about how with the Labour government on both sides of the M4 is the motorway or highway between Cardiff and London. So with the Labour government on both ends of the M4, um, everything would change in Wales. You know, the Labour government in Westminster would work so much more closely with the Welsh Labour government compared to sort of you know a relationship of conflict between Conservatives in Westminster and Labour in Cardiff. Um, but then that just didn't happen. Um, for instance, you know, Welsh Labour announced, record investment for the railway. Turns out it was less than the Conservatives had invested in the past 5 years of their government in Welsh railways. Um, and so I think that's a really key point. Is nothing had changed despite all the promises. Everything had sort of
Mhm.
stayed the same. And I suppose a lot of the politicians wanted to downplay, but the constant scandal within the Labour Party, which broadly fits into this idea of status quo. Towards the end of the Conservative Party time in government for 14 years, it just became mired in scandal after scandal after scandal. And you just think, who's running my country? All they seem to be doing is getting in trouble with one thing or another.
Yeah.
And that's what was happening with the Labour government, but just on a faster timescale and earlier on. Um, you had the scandal with Angela Rayner and her failure to pay enough tax on her second home. You had the Peter Mandelson scandal and his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. You had cash for peerages effectively from Lord Ali, where Lord Ali would buy Keir Starmer a brand new wardrobe, give him a flat in London, in order to get sort of positions of power and patronage within Parliament. Then you had a corruption minister having to resign for corruption, uh, a homelessness minister having to resign for making people homeless. And so it was sort of the really ironic scandals that were happening week after week after week. And people just went, "You are no different to the Tories. We voted you to kick out." And I think
Mhm.
people were just fed up with it. On top of then within Wales, those really structural issues of the worst NHS, waiting lists,
Mhm.
really bad educational outcomes, underinvestment, and just broken promises on top of it then.
Yeah. Hmm. I mean, I think of, if you live in, again, I haven't spent much time in the UK, so I can't really speak to this, and I'm kind of imposing my own experience on it. So forgive me for that. But um, in a country like in Canada, for instance, we've got a crisis of social services. It's maybe not as acute and severe as the one in the UK is. But if you live in Southern Ontario, which is where the economic heart is, you don't feel that crisis. So if you're in London, I imagine you don't really feel that crisis as acutely because whatever resources exist there, right?
Yeah.
But as you get further and further out from the economic core, um, when you go to or the economic and political core, like when you get to Wales, I can see where the problems just manifest themselves quicker and more harshly, and so people are more upset.
I would broadly agree with that. Although I think we're in such dire straits in the United Kingdom. Everyone feels these issues. Maybe certain issues are emphasized elsewhere more than somewhere. So in London, for instance, housing is a massive issue, and housing prices. You cannot live in London on a normal wage. So if you are
Mhm.
a chef or a cleaner, you can't live in London. It's just impossible. Um, Whereas in Wales, I think a lack of jobs. I think this comes back to this point of just general dissatisfaction with the way things are going, and that then they
Mhm.
felt that Welsh Labour and Labour in Westminster have not done anything to fix it. I mean, since the mines have closed, nothing really has in a way in of jobs for the Welsh mining communities in the valleys. Um, and so a lot of them can't work, don't work where they can, but don't earn enough money really to enjoy themselves and move forward. Um,
Mhm.
and so there's a lot of destitution. and then taxes keep going up. Um, but I think everyone, including Reform and the Conservatives and even Plaid Cymru to a certain extent, although they're partially responsible for it, um, were really emphasising how Wales is the worst of of the three kingdoms, effectively within the United Kingdom. They are, I mean, everything is just worse in Wales, no matter what you look at, and
Mm,
it's so they're looking for an answer, and Labour was no longer that answer after so many years of broken promises.
hmm. Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, okay, so across the UK, Labour was, defeated rather badly. But before we jumped on, you said they maybe weren't beaten as badly as people thought they might be.
Um,
Can you, yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that?
yeah, I, I mean, let's. I don't want to downplay that they lost a lot of councillors, 1,498 councillors, and as I was saying earlier, the ripple effects from that's a lot of people who won't be campaigning for Labour or potentially reconsidering whether they will ever campaign for Labour again. Um, but they still retained 1,068 councillors, which again is a lot of people. And I think, considering that they are the incumbent party, they had the most councillors up for election this election. Um, and so when you think of all of those factors, their defeat is put into a broader perspective of yes, they lost a lot, but they also did very well to retain so many as well. There was a lot of talk within the media of how the Labour vote would simply just collapse. You know, effectively there'd be no Labour councillors left, is what a lot of, the lines were coming out from newspapers and like, our BBC. That effectively, you're gonna have like three Labour councillors left and that's it. But that really didn't happen. The Labour vote still did hold somewhat within certain areas. Um, I mean, they still did retain some boroughs in London, which no one predicted. Everyone thought, they would sort of lose everything in London and that would all go to the Greens. But that, again, that wasn't the case. Um, and they were still retained many councils generally, so they retained power within councils to make decisions.
Right.
Um, so yeah, and as I was saying earlier about this, the importance of these local elections, I think it'd be really interesting to understand how many Labour voters actually went out to vote. So how many Labour voters then? So in reverse, how many Labour voters went? I'm not happy with how Labour is doing, but I can't bring myself to vote for anyone else, and I don't particularly want to vote for them because they're doing such a terrible job. So was this because there was actually a flight from Labour to Reform, or there was just a lack of sustained Labour support because people just
Mm.
didn't want to vote Labour?
Do you think there's been much of a flight? I mean, I think people typically assume that reform have been capturing dissatisfied Tories, and that its main threat has been to the main threat it offers is to the Conservative Party. Um, from across the Atlantic, and again, not being embedded in it, not following it on a day-to-day basis, just sort of following it. I've always thought that there is potentially this threat to labor. I mean, I think of Boris Johnson breaking down the red wall, and in the 2019 election. And so, I mean, there's labor voters that are at least transactional and willing to go to other parties. And on economic issues, there's a lot of alignment between as factions of the Labor Party and Reform UK.
So I definitely think there is flight. I think there is a lot of movement from Labour to Reform. I think especially within the red wall that feel just completely dissatisfied with a lack of jobs, um, and just feel like Westminster and politics isn't working for them. And so I say, that's the Labour on the right of the party. Um, so sort of West Streeting esque Labour supporters, and in a way, just I'd say the more, you know, I'm a Roman Catholic, and we have sort of a phrase called cradle Catholics, and people who go to church because they feel that they have to on special occasions, but they're not real believers. And I think you have cradle Labour supporters. You have people who've been brought up as a Labour supporter, and they do it because that's what their parents did, that's what their grandparents did, but they're not entirely convinced by the Labour argument. And so when it gets to points, these epochs within the Labour Party where everything's just going wrong, and so the basic things of the economy is not working, you then become dissatisfied and you move somewhere else. But you're not ideologically left wing. You've only been Labour because you've always been told to be Labour, and you're probably quite conservative in a lot of your social and economic viewpoints. You're just quite pragmatic. You think, as long as I've got a job, as long as I get a job, as long as I have money in my pocket, as long as I can buy a pint on the weekend to have with friends, then I'm happy. I don't care who's in power as long as I can have that. And so, therefore,
Mhm.
they go to the next best solution. They voted Conservative in 2019. Conservatives betrayed their promises. They voted then for Labour again in 2024. And within 2 years, those promises have been betrayed. So they're moving on. They're cycling through who they think could actually deliver on, handing them a nirvana in a way, a sort of a paradise where they can work, they can have fun, they can have a disposable income, things will work well like the NHS, roads will be, well looked after, etc. And so it is quite transactional. There has been flight, but I think that's really, the cradle Labour supporters. I think there are some people who are very ideologically committed, who may be in the centre of the party, who despise reform, despise the Tories, and maybe just did feel like I can't go out to support Labour, but I can't vote for anyone else.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I think of, or, I can imagine how, especially in those traditional labor communities that have been, that are that are working class communities and have been working class communities for much of a century, or longer than a century, and that they just, everybody votes labor, and so you just vote labor because if you don't vote labor, you got to explain something to somebody,
Yeah.
and like you just don't really believe or care much enough about anything to vote. And yeah, okay. I mean, and that it and that makes sense that that's the group that got excited about has been gotten excited among the labor constituency at least for maybe even UKIP and now Reform UK.
Well, and but
Or
also got very excited by Boris Johnson because
and
he
got
managed.
very excited by Boris Johnson too. Yeah, that's a good point.
Um,
Um,
but
Interesting.
then
Okay.
because they're just
Sorry,
typically
go ahead.
very anti-establishment. I think that's or they're anti-establishment because the establishment isn't working anymore, not for them.
Right. Right.
So it's not really a matter of ideology, just pragmatism, really, voting with their feet.
I mean, you mentioned that, they're kind of hoping for a nirvana, and I think that's really astute because the question I was going to ask is, well, what do they want?
Um,
And I mean, and then the follow-up question would be, I mean, you answered what they wanted. And so my follow-up question is any of that possible?
I think it is. Um, I think I think we can give these people jobs and effectively, I suppose, a sense of purpose in life again. A lot of these working class people, they feel, without a job and they just sit at home all day, they feel like, well, what's the point to my life? Um, and then on top of that, you could both have them working and you could probably lower taxes so they have greater disposable income. And then s- they could spend it on things. It's just cultural within the UK that people go out for a pint on the weekend. They have a beer with their friends.
Hmm.
The pub is very much ingrained in British culture. I think more so than anywhere else in the world, of that very sort of, it's a very distinct sort of socializing. Um, and I think that is possible, but it requires a lot of fundamental reform. I think, this, we're talking major structural reform of the way government operates, the civil service, in order to reduce inefficiency, um, and therefore to reduce wastage and therefore save money. Um, Tony Blair talks a little bit about this. I mean, so obviously you sent me that essay from Tony Blair that was written, published yesterday.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, although I don't like Tony Blair, I this is
It's
the
okay,
first
you're
time.
under the age of 50, I wouldn't expect anybody under the age of 50 to like Tony Blair.
I think this is the first time I've ever really agreed with him, and I think this is what reform is getting right: is that there's a really big sense of something needs to be done. Not we're anti this or anti that. There's a project that is central to their argument. And I think that reforms project of, effectively dismantling the deep state, or, in American terms, drain the swamp. Um, it is about, fundamentally reforming how British government operates, both to reduce wastage and also to, I suppose, bring back accountability to the people.
Sure.
Um, and I think through fundamental reform like that, I think it is possible. Um,
But can you do that fundamental reform, like, you know, how about politically, in the sense that it's very, trying to get the factions to agree on it, trying to get you know, welfare reform is great in theory, but in practice, it means a lot of people are going to worry that they're going to be missing meals.
so I think, although we spoke about this at the beginning, that these are a lot of difficult answers. I think British people, from my personal experience, are becoming more attuned or more willing to accept those difficult answers, because we've reached a point now. I mean, we've reached an epoch where people have gone, things just aren't getting better at all. Things
Hmm.
just keep getting worse and worse and worse. Taxes keep going up and up and up, but productivity of our state is going down. And so I think people have gone, I think people are more coming around to this idea that something does need to change. Maybe they disagree currently where that change it needs to happen, but I think within time that will become a consensus. I think people can be people are in the position now to be convinced. William Cobbett, used to talk about how I defy you to rile up any man who's got a full stomach. The sense that when it does affect your back pocket, when you are feeling hungry, when you don't have that weekly pint anymore with your friends, people will be willing to go, hang on, let me listen to what this person has to say. And I think this is why reform has been able to do so well recently compared to, the other forms of Nigel Farage's movement like UKIP, is this economic destitution and this disenfranchisement is more broad now. It's affecting a lot of people. And I think that means they're open to the argument that there does need to be welfare reform. I know many people in working class communities, especially around where I live, that think, no, there does need to be welfare reform. I was talking to some local residents and they were saying, I work three part-time jobs. I'm up at 6 a.m. going to my first job. I work 12-hour days. When I'm up at 6 a.m., I see the lights on of other people's homes, but they don't have jobs. They have three cars on the driveway that they've bought from welfare money. And so people are becoming more and more dissatisfied with this. And I
Hmm.
think it's only a matter of time before this dissatisfaction, which is open to convincing, turns into consensus on what needs to be done.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think you're right, and I think I like you, I have faith in the British people in the end. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be pretty. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not saying it's going to be a linear. but I do have faith in the British people. Like I have faith in the American people, and most people around the world, frankly, that in the end we'll get it right. There might be a whole lot of stuff that goes wrong in the interim, but in the end we'll get it right.
Yeah.
Uh, but clearly, the short, obvious answer that's going to solve everybody's problems is if we kick Starmer out of the prime minister's out of 10 Downing and recruit um, the king of the north, right? That's going to solve everybody's problems.
Uh, Again, I turn to Tony Blair's great essay, and I loathe that I say that. I think kicking out Starmer won't change anything because Labour doesn't have a project. They don't have
Mhm.
his sort of constitutional ideas of reform for the United Kingdom that he had in 1997. Um, they don't have, the Brexit project of Boris Johnson in 2019. Um, and so, no matter what happens, whoever becomes leader, because Andy Burnham may not even win that by-election, which would be slightly amusing. Um, I think no matter who becomes prime minister next, or if Keir Starmer stays, nothing's going to change until the next general election. Because,
Right.
I mean, Tony Blair says that the Labour Party needs to decide on this project before they elect the new leader so that they can decide who they think's best to lead this project. I think that is so. I think that's just impossible for a party in an in a parliamentary session to sort of radically change its course. I think it's really dangerous for democracy for a party to go, we were elected on the vagaries of not being conservative to then being whatever this new project might be, which will be radically different.
Well, this is why
And
it's really hard to change course in government,
yeah,
right? And this is a Labour Party that was elected in 2024 without a vision.
yes,
I
um,
mean, they're to be being out of power for as long as they were. I mean, I guess you can give Jeremy Corbyn one thing: he had a vision. Um, Whether anybody liked that vision or not, whether very many people like that vision or not, it's an open question. But I think that was the one thing that kind of united the various factions of the Labour Party was that. And again, this is from across the Atlantic, so feel free to disagree with me on every level here, but that they couldn't agree on a vision. And so they went with the vision of we're not Tories, and Keir Starmer is not a Tory, and he has no vision either.
I mean, I think politicians are inherently lazy, so they saw what do we need to do? What's the least amount we can do to win this election? So, oh, all we need to do is say we're not those bad people,
Hmm.
and so that's all they went with. They didn't actually work hard on actually going what needs to be done in this country to fundamentally fix it, and that's our vision, that's our project. Um, and I think, of course, the Tories.
And I think people like British people realistically like there's a problem that needs to be fixed, and we really don't trust the Tories to fix it after the last 14 years. So why not trust these guys who are at least not the Tories?
Yeah, and I think also it's back to this point of at this point, in British history, people are willing to be convinced, but people haven't reached a consensus of what needs to be fixed.
Right.
So people are, something needs to be done. We've reached a point of no return in a way. Something needs to be done, something radical. But what that is, people don't know. And so that's why you've got this sort of polarity between the Greens and Reform now, is
Mhm.
people are latching on to radicalism because something needs to be done.
Right.
Um,
And
and
we has sort of established this,
yeah,
this desire for radical change.
yes. And so what you saw with Labour in 2024 was things need to change. That was their motto, was change. But because there was no consensus, they appealed to that fact that change could mean anything to anyone. So it meant exactly what people wanted it to mean. So that could mean to me civil service reform. That could mean to Joe two doors down an end to migration. That could mean to Sarah three doors up. You know, I don't know, more taxes if that's what she would.
Seizing the means of production.
Exactly. So change. because people just want change, it just appealed to everyone.
Right, right. Okay. I think I'm convinced that bringing Andy Burnham into 10 Downing Street is probably not going to wildly shift the trajectory of British politics here. But um, let's put your pundit hat on for a second. Can Starmer survive this?
I've been an optimist for Starmer's survival for a long time. Um, when when all of this started coming out about Peter Mandelson, back in sort of February March time, I said he'll survive this. It will be after the local elections. I have to say, I think he will survive this for now. I think there's usually what happens with these leadership elections, it requires momentum. The momentum's sort of been stopped by the fact that everyone's gone, let's wait to have a leadership election. Let's wait till all the best, as West Reading says, the best candidates are on the field,
Hmm.
um, so that we can make a proper decision. I think by the time Andy Burnham, the actual, because the by-election in Makersfield is on the 18th of June. So we've got
Okay.
what, another 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I think by the time he does or does not win that by election, I think the momentum will be out of the Sails for Change within the Labour Party. There's a couple of good reports coming through economically in terms of growth, NHS statistics, which are showing people that, maybe not everything's horrific under Starmer. And I think, maybe the idea of, oh, we're becoming like the Tory Party where we're going to just cycle through leaders will start to set in. And I think that will probably lose momentum. Um, but I'm a bit tentative because that may not be the case. But I think he will survive maybe till post conference season. The unions, who are massive supporters of the Labour Party, and like businesses are for the Tories, they're the biggest donors and are the biggest sort of constituency within the Labour Party. They want the leadership election to happen at conference, so that there's sort of a massive sort of formalised like process for the debates and platform for them, so people can be properly engaged and people can actually set out a plan. So I think conference time or just after will be when there's the leadership election. So I think he will survive for now, but I don't think he'll survive his whole term.
So you don't think Keir Starmer is going to be the Labour leader going into the next general election?
No.
No. Okay. But then conference season's the fall, right?
Yeah, October.
October. Okay. Well, I mean, and so I'm just trying to do so the next general election is scheduled for 2029, correct?
Yes. The Prime Minister has the prerogative
Of
to call
course.
it whenever. So it will be what the latest would be July 2029.
So you know what? This is a good question, and I don't necessarily know the mechanics of, constitutional British politics in the same way that I know Canadian politics. But if Keir Starmer was a Canadian Prime Minister, like in September, he'd call a general election. He'd force a snap election because he
Okay.
sees the knives on his front bench out, and he would say, "No, do you really want him out? Let's go. Your jobs are threatened now too." Is that something that can happen has that ever happened in British politics?
Yeah,
Something
so
like that?
Boris Johnson did it in 2019.
Right.
So um the
But it
Conservative Party.
required but I remember dissolving parliament required a whole bunch of things to go, like there was a whole bunch of institutional things and like legal things that were required to dissolve parliament, which like delayed it 3 months or something.
Yeah, so it is quite complex because obviously you have to ask, because we have the figurehead of the king to sort and
Right.
he plays a very ceremonial and procedural role, of actually having to go to the king and ask him to dissolve parliament and give the reasons. But yes, in theory, there could be a snap election, but obviously it would take time in itself. But there could be a general election before 2029. Um, I don't quite know sort of the limits, whether it's like 3 months has to be the period between like the calling of an election and an actual election.
That's what the
In
writ
terms of
period would have to be. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, but but yes, I mean he could call one now and sort of say, well, you want me out, we'll put it to the people, and maybe you'll lose your seats too.
Right.
Um,
Or at least threaten it.
yeah, maybe that is what he did. Maybe in
You
that
know?
cabinet meeting that one morning, the day before the day before the state opening of Parliament,
Yeah.
maybe that's what he did, um, and which maybe cooled some of the tempers, apart from West Streetings, obviously.
Uh,
Um,
I mean, anyway, one of the great, like, if this was Australia, Starmer would have been out 6 months ago, 4 months ago, right? Because in Australia, like, your prime minister, every day you walk into the office, it could be your last because of the spill process, right? Where like your cabinet can just say bye bye. We're making this guy prime minister. So like every day of your life is possible death in the Australian political system. In Britain and other Commonwealth countries, there's a lot more. You've got a lot more confidence as party leader that like you wake up in the morning, you're probably still going to be party leader that night.
yeah,
But one of the great prerogatives you have as party leader is that you can always crash the government, and like especially if you're the prime minister, you can crash the government anytime you want.
I'm quite thankful they don't though.
No, but in the sense of like you know, you can make anything you want a confidence motion,
Yeah,
right? You can, which again, protect you. You do that to protect yourself. You can, again, you can call a snap election if you absolutely need to. Anyway, there's tools that a prime minister has that like a president doesn't. Now, a president knows he's going to, there's no opportunity to bring down an executive in the same way in the United States that you can in the Westminster system.
yeah,
But I do, I think you're right. Maybe in that cabinet meeting, that was what he threatened. He was like, okay, you really want me gone? You know what? Like, if you really want me gone, I can hang on like I'm going to be able to hang on a few days, and you have no idea what I can do in those few days.
yeah. I I dread to think what happened in that cabinet meeting.
Yeah. But assuming Starmer is out by conference season, do you think Burnham's the obvious successor?
I mean, that does depend on whether he wins that by-election.
Sure,
Uh,
assuming he wins the by-election.
yeah, I think if he wins the by-election, then yes, because
Okay.
in a way he represents that change that people want, that other people can't represent, because he's, despite having been a cabinet minister under Tony Blair, he's been out of Parliament for so long,
Hmm.
and so therefore he represents sort of an anti-establishment or extra-establishment figure, um, which sort of Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, and any of the other nameless candidates that could appear, um, represent. Um, I think also, again, this vagueness, which sort of is the name of the game for the Labour Party, is because they're so factionalized, they sort of need to be vague, because they need sort of mottos that appeal to everyone in the Labour Party, that they take from it what they want. Um, and so a term that's being thrown around in British media at the moment is Manchesterism. Um, so the King of the North, Andy Burnham, is Mayor of Manchester, and no one really quite knows what he stands for. He's a bit of a chameleon. Um, and so they call it Manchesterism, which is this sort of very pragmatic approach of state working with private enterprise to get the best results out. because some people want to label him as a massive socialist, some people want to label him as, a right wing of the party, but what they've come to the conclusion is it's neither. It's just very vague and sort of a mishmash of all of it. So I think Andy Burnham would be really successful in both being outside of the establishment and being this vague character that Starmer was and that the Labour Party was in 2024, to appeal to a broad brush of people. So that when he says, I don't know, a vote for Burnham, some people will think that's a vote for socialism, some people will think that's a vote for anti immigration, and they'll take from it what they want. Whereas
It's a
Wes
good
Streeting,
it's a sorry, go ahead.
whereas Wes Streeting, he's very firmly the right of the party. Angela Rayner is very much on the soft left of the party. And so they're very defined by people, even if they're not defined by themselves. People have very
Mhm.
strict definitions of where they stand, and so have
Right.
their opinions made up of them.
Yeah, they have defined factions or defined, roles that they're expected to play in the party, which makes leading the party when there's other factions, it means that you enter a leadership contest with the baggage of the fact that other factions don't like you.
Yeah. And I think Andy Burnham, in a way, doesn't have a strict faction that supports him. He has a broad brush of loads of people from loads of factions.
Right.
Um, and so he could be the consensus candidate. But I think as we saw within the Tory party, is once Starmer goes, it will just be chaos from that point onwards. Because
Yeah.
once Burnham comes in, the knives will already be half unsheathed by the Angela Rayner supporters and the Wes Streeting supporters. They'll be
Right.
waiting for him to slip up to then take
Right.
him down and get their man in, as we
Yeah.
saw with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
Rishi Sunak supporters were waiting for Liz Truss to stumble at anything. Just so happened that she crashed the economy. Um, so that was quite a big thing that people could sort of go, yeah, we're going to take her out for this. But,
You could have called the election right after.
um, but I think, that's the problem of once you get rid of the prime minister who won the election, it's just chaos. The factions, there's nothing, there's no glue holding them together.
It becomes, the year of the five emperors in Rome,
Yeah.
right? It's just constant turmoil and nobody has any real, like, once it becomes standard practice, like there sort of has to be a degree of myth in, like, we can't touch the guy, he's our leader,
Yeah.
right? We can disagree with him, there could be all sorts of stuff going, but in the end of the day, he's the leader, we got to deal with him or her, right? But when you start being like, well, no, we don't,
Yeah.
all of a sudden there's no stability, it's total chaos, and you have to be in the only it's going to become clear that the only way you can control, like, Nigel Farage is a different animal because he built everything with reform,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
the Reform UK is him. He is Reform UK.
Yeah, reform is an extension of his will,
Yeah.
right? Whereas the other, Green Party aside, the two main the duopoly parties, I mean, I don't know how you run either of these parties anymore as a leader without being the most ruthless SOB, like, imaginable, in order to
Yeah.
maintain party cohesion.
So this was one of Keir Starmer's failings, and why he's maybe not stupid, but politically completely inept. Is one of the things that you'll hear a lot of people say Boris Johnson did was he met with his backbenchers all the time. He'd have weekly meetings with many of his different backbenchers asking, what's going on in your constituency? What do you need? Do you need this investment? Do you need that? What will help you keep your seat? What will help keep your constituents happy with the Conservative Party and with you? What can I do to help? Keir Starmer doesn't know half of his backbenchers, partially because
Mhm.
there are a lot of new faces, but he hasn't made the effort to speak with them, meet with them, get to know them,
Mhm.
because he's so much of a bureaucrat, or as a new sort of phrase that's coming up in British terminology is the lanyard class. Um, and he's too much of that. He thinks it's just all about processes, clean, technical, not this sort of socializing, pressing of the flesh that is
Mm,
British politics. Um,
right.
and so that's how you should control these broad parties, is you should sort of appeal to the individual rather than the factions. Um,
Well, that's part of being a good ruthless party manager,
yeah,
because you need to have because if you have the backbench, if the backbench kind of likes you can mobilize them against your front bench.
but also that's where the compromise will happen. Is if you are
Mm.
sat in a meeting room with a backbencher who hates the welfare reform bill, you can go, "Why do you hate it? What's wrong with it?" And they can go,
Yeah.
"Well, half of my constituency aren't, you know, benefits. They need that, and there's no
Mhm.
jobs." And so you can go, "Okay, how can we fix that? We can put a factory there. We can put some investment there. We can build a road there,
Right.
so there's jobs."
Yeah.
And that's where you get the compromise. But if you're not having those meetings, you can't reach the compromise. So therefore, you just don't get anything done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point on Starmer. Like, I mean, that is sort of the reputation that he has, but that notion that he's just I really believe he's never been able to manage people ask whether he can control the Labor Party, and I've always wondered, well, he can't even control his cabinet. So does he control the party more broadly? No. Um, and what Streeting did there is just is the most obvious evidence of it. But clearly, he's being undermined by his cabinet ministers on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of scoops came out about Ed Miliband briefing
Right.
against Starmer, trying to organise support around Andy Burnham. And I think if there's a cabinet minister who's still in your cabinet and is doing that, that's a massive problem.
No kidding. No kidding. And the thing is, I know Starmer would like to get rid of him, but you know he
But
can't. Why can't you?
because he requires all of those different cabinet ministers to manage the individual factions because he
Mhm.
hasn't managed any personal relationships within the party.
Right.
Whereas a good prime minister will do both. He will have personal relationships with the backbenchers, and then he'll give patronage to certain high-ranking members of those factions to sort of say, "I am listening to you." But that's an aid to the personal relationships he's forming, not
Right.
the only thing.
Okay. So if Burnham is unable to win the by-election, who becomes leader?
I think Angela Rayner.
That's my sense too. That's
Um,
interesting.
I,
Why do you think that's the case?
the party is more left wing than it is centre. Wedge Streeting is almost universally hated, both by the Parliamentary Labour Party as well as the actual core membership. I mean, the unions hate him. Um, he talks a lot about privatisation of the NHS, and I think also, Labour MPs will realise his stumble into let's rejoin the EU is not the key to winning the red wall back, which was predominantly leave. So they can either vote for someone like Angela Rayner, who came from parts of, the red wall, is very sort of straight talking, um, quite socially left wing, but also quite economically left wing, very working class, left with no GCSEs from secondary school. She, in a way, tries to present herself as emblematic of a good British person from the streets, where streeting is not that. So Angela Rayner has so many different things that make her viable for winning elections. Is she's actually popular within the Parliamentary Labour Party? She has the support of the unions and the membership, whereas West Streeting lacks all three. That said, it's also hard to sort of tell at this point because I don't know who else is going to throw their hat in the ring. Jess Phillips, through her resignation, she was the minister who's also responsible for the grooming gangs inquiry, trying to put that together. She's quite popular. She's very straight talking again. Carl Turner, who's a suspended Labour MP, said that her resigning was her basically throwing her hat in the ring and saying, "I'm interested in coming in." By throwing in the towel so early, she was distancing herself in order that she could run later.
That
But
makes
it's
sense.
hard to tell. I think if it's a competition or contest between Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting, I think it'd be Angela Rayner.
Hmm. Now, I've taken up a lot of your time, Tom. So I want to be very sensitive to that. So I'm just, you know what, I could ask you questions all day, but I'm gonna ask you one last one. We've made it this far and we haven't mentioned the Tories really at all. Um, the Tories obviously didn't do very well. We don't need to jump too far into that in the local elections. But can Kemi Badenoch win the next election for the Tories?
If I put my Tory hat on, of course. Um,
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
if I take the Tory hat off, I really don't think so.
Okay.
Um, I think if we look at those local election results, as we see still a lot of deep-seated resentment and distrust of the Conservatives, even in the face of Labour chaos, people are still like, but the Tories are just the same.
Right.
Um, and I think 14 years where things didn't really change, which have led to this point where people have gone, things just keep getting worse. 14 years of Tory government preceded that point.
Right.
I do have to be honest, this hasn't just happened within 2 years of a Labour government.
Of course
This
not.
has
Yeah.
been this has been a lot of this has been in a way a progression or a regression and a decline, a managed
Mhm.
decline for 14 years and before that as well. And so people, I don't think, are going to forgive them in 5 years. Um, and I think, again, it's the same with the Labour Party. There's a stagnant political class, you know,
Mhm.
despite everything Kemi Badenoch will say about how different she is and how she's reforming the party, there's no there's no revolutionary political class that's coming through with a revolutionary vision and project. It's all the policy announcements have been, we're going to cut stamp duty, we're going to, well, yeah, get rid of stamp duty, we're going to reduce this, we're going to do that, minor edits. People aren't
Mhm.
calling for minor edits anymore. This isn't about perfecting the country, this is about rebuilding one.
Right.
And
Well, I
so
mean, and that's an interesting point. I mean, a lot of the advertisement and campaign stuff I've seen from the Tories is, Bednock talking about her proposal, which would save power consumers 600, or like 250 pounds a year. And it's like, listen, 250 pounds a year is 250 pounds a year. Don't get me wrong. But, like, when that's what you're talking about, like, that's the centerpiece of every piece of, like, propaganda I see,
yeah,
that's pretty small potatoes.
yeah, I think unless, but I can't see it because the Conservative Party is still full of pretty much all the same MPs that were there during the 14 years. And that's why I say there's a stagnant political
Mhm,
class. And that's what this sort of, but I don't even think reform can really solve this issue. I think, people need to politics has become like a game and people want to flip the board because they just so require revolutionary change. Not revolutionary in the sense of revolutionizing the economic system, but just fundamental reform of the state.
yeah, and I mean, I think we saw in the 14 years under the Tories that the one nation conservatism ethos was not up to that task. It was up to maybe managing decline pretty effectively, but it wasn't up to the task. And, I mean, if I'm putting on again, I'm not I live across the Atlantic. The Reform UK, while they may have a lot of very interesting ideas, I mean, we're not Reform UK isn't particularly interested in attacking the state-driven aspects of the economy in the UK right now. You
No.
know, I think somebody described them as boomer communism, and which I think is a little harsh, but it's you know, you're not going to see the triple lock reformed under Nigel Farage.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of economic populism with reform. Following, it's about really trying to win that sort of red wall sort of system, and
Mm.
is less about, anything else.
Making the
Um,
economy more productive.
yeah, it does. Again, I think it's a problem with politics in general that it's become a game of trying to win the media's attention rather than a
Mm.
broad strategic 5 year, 10 year, 20-year plan about
Right.
restructuring the country to make it better. It's more about, oh, people like this idea, will follow that. People
Mhm.
like that idea will go down that avenue. And that sort of looking for clicks, looking for instant gratification, rather than rebuilding a party around a singular message, not an individual, but a message and a vision and a project, and then having a strategy of how to achieve that.
Yeah.
Because then I think also that makes the politics of it in Parliament so much easier. Because
Mhm.
when a vision wins a mandate, that means people can't really argue with it. When an individual wins a mandate with no vision, people can go, well, the mandate's then sort of ambiguous what it was for. Was it for the charisma of Keir Starmer in 2024? Absolutely not, because there was no charisma. So what did the people give him his authority for to do? That people
Mhm.
don't know, because there was no vision, there was no project at the center of his manifesto. It was just him,
Yeah.
or him being anti-Tory.
Mhm. Well, Tom, thank you very much. We've talked for 90 minutes. That's more than I usually go. So thank you very much for that. It's been great to get your perspective. I know our listeners in the United States and around the world, of course. We are seeking global reach, of course. Will have enjoyed this. So Tom, thank you very much, and we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.